We'll now be reading some biographies for Dark Reign. Jeb Radic. Jebediah Radic was born in 2588 to marked parents in the Remus cluster. At the age of 12, he was assigned to new colonization duty after paralyzing a teenage boy in a street fight. The pioneer age was over, and planetary exploration was of marginal importance to the Imperium. Colonization remained a hazardous endeavor, and was used primarily as punishment for members of the marked class who resisted the regime, but whose crimes did not warrant execution. Radic was among the youngest to ever be assigned to colonization duty. At 16, Radic escaped by sabotaging a nuclear waste facility on a colony near the Algo Rim, and stowing away in an Imperium cruiser. In the confusion that followed, hundreds were killed in the fallout from the explosion of the waste dump, mostly members of the marked crew that Radic worked with. Years later, when Radic was questioned about the incident as a Freedom Guard commander, he said, "I won't fight for the freedom of any man who doesn't have the dignity to fight for it himself." The Imperium hunted Radic unsuccessfully for several years. When the Freedom Guard revolution began, Radic was smuggling black market goods on Auran, the heart of the rebellion. He led a mob of rioters who seized the capital city of Borud and captured and executed hundreds of Imperium soldiers. Shortly thereafterward, a volunteer army was organized on Auran, and Radic was asked by Gerhard Bantrol to serve as a field commander for the region. Bantrol, the newly appointed Freedom Guard Synod counselor on Auran, was a respected statesman and former Imperium officer who had joined the cause of the revolutionaries. Radic accepted, confiding to Bantrol that his motivation was not justice, but vengeance. His success as a military leader was remarkable. In spite of the urgings of his superiors, Radic always fought on the front lines with his men. He rarely lost a conflict, and as his military victories convinced the masses that the Imperium dominion could be challenged, the ranks of the Freedom Guard swelled. Within a year, the Synod had placed him in command of the entire standing army. Within 3 years, he had taken control of the Synod. Throughout his career as a commander, Radic was known for his refusal to take prisoners. Radic's troops fought with barbarous ferocity, and some believe this was because his soldiers were more afraid of him than they were of the enemy. Radic once offered to relinquish his command to any man that could best him in a fair fight, and was taken up on the challenge several times, until he threw one of his officers out of the window of a 40-story command center on Perlin. Radic lived well past the age of 25. Although members of the Mark did occasionally live past their 25th year, it was extremely rare, and generally proved only a few months of extra life. Radic's longevity caused many to believe the commander was superhuman. Others thought that the force of his will simply would not allow him to die until he had seen the Imperium defeated. Stiv Bator. Like most Shadow Hand operatives, Stiv Bator was genetically engineered from donor DNA to be ideally suited for intelligence work. From birth, he was the property of the Shadow Hand, and was trained, even as an infant, to excel in basic precognitive functions like hand-eye coordination, reflex latency, and pattern recognition. Even among the ranks of the Shadow Hand, the galaxy's most efficient and remorseless soldiers, Bator was clearly superior. By the age of 18, he had committed countless assassinations and infiltrations without failure. Some in the upper ranks of the Shadow Hand worried that Bator was too good. They feared that if he were ever to defect, there was no one in the ranks of the Imperium he couldn't kill if he chose to. Those that had worked with Bator understood that this was impossible. His loyalty was absolute. He was emotionless, single-minded, barely human. Nonetheless, the ruling directorate instructed the Shadow Hand to assign Bator to a suicide mission. He was injected with the enzyme keys that caused the mark, and was instructed to penetrate the Freedom Guard command. Bator was successful, but the introduction of the mark into his system meant he would not live past age 25 unless a counteragent to the mark was developed. Gil Karach. Gil Karach, one of the leading geneticists in all of the galaxy, was recruited by the Imperium ruling directorate to research new strains of catalytic enzyme keys, like the one used to make the mark. The directorate secretly planned to develop more subtle keys that would make people more intelligent, but less willful, and less concerned with their own well-being. They could then introduce these agents into entire populations to make them more productive and easier to control. This would require a much more advanced type of enzyme than that used to produce the mark. Geneticists had long been able to introduce catalysts that would alter an organism at the genetic level and therefore carry the modification into the organism's offspring. However, a change like the mark, which made the carrier die at age 25, was a basic addition to the genetic code. Altering an intangible entity, like personality or intellect, was a far trickier undertaking. Many scientists believed that thoughts and actions could not be directly mapped to physiological occurrences. Karach, however, had meticulously recorded long-term neural firing patterns within individuals, and demonstrated that for any person, a model could be extrapolated from the data that would predict behavior within reasonable statistical parameters. Karach further discovered that the behavioral models of family members were surprisingly similar. Clearly, personality was at least partially inherited. For almost a decade, Karach attempted, with enormous Imperium funding, to determine the exact genetic underpinnings of human character. As Karach approached what he was looking for, he learned of the ruling directorate's plans for his work. He uncovered several experiments where genetic keys had been developed based on his findings and introduced into Imperium soldiers to make them less concerned for their own safety. Karach was appalled when he realized the magnitude of what could be done with his work and research. He secretly sabotaged his work and attempted to leak a cure for the mark, which was also being developed under his direction, to the Freedom Guard. And my namesake, Gregor Trilkin. Gregor Trilkin was the youngest of 4 sons, born to a poor nuclear technician in a small cluster of planets near the galactic rim. Gregor's mother passed away when he was an infant, and by the time Trilkin was in his early teens, all of his brothers had died of radiation-related illnesses. At 17, Trilkin left his father, who was institutionalized and almost completely senile, and joined the Imperium Galactic Fleet. During his basic training, Trilkin gained favor with his superiors by reporting several soldiers who were distributing contraband material to the cadets. Several days later, Trilkin was savagely beaten by these same soldiers, who were subsequently court-martialed and imprisoned. Trilkin demonstrated an immediate talent for military tactics and was offered a position as an instructor at the military academy on Shendan. He refused, requesting active duty, and was placed in command of a small company of interceptor-class light warships, patrolling for smugglers near the Turndorf Nebula. Within a year, almost all smuggling in the region had been eliminated. Imperium law allowed for immediate execution of any individual caught trading illegal goods, but the provision was almost never exercised. Some regions survived on black market trade, and most policing officials simply ignored the practice. Trilkin, however, did not. He captured dozens of smugglers and executed them all. By the time of the Freedom Guard Revolution began, Trilkin had reached the rank of colonel. While many Imperium officers wished to avoid combat duty, Trilkin immediately requested frontline duty. In the early years of the conflict, the Freedom Guard was poorly equipped and unorganized, and Trilkin dealt them crushing defeats whenever he was able to engage their forces squarely. What Trilkin lacked in tactical subtlety, he made up for with unflagging tenacity and merciless brutality. Trilkin was quickly promoted to general, and shortly thereafter was the driving force behind the Purge. As the Freedom Guard began to enjoy its first military victories, pressure was high within Imperium ranks to find scapegoats. Trilkin accused several of his fellow commanders of being Freedom Guard sympathizers. Although there was no evidence to support his indictment, the men were discharged, and the phenomenon quickly spread. Eventually, hundreds of high-ranking Imperium officials and military commanders were accused of treason. Most of the accused were relieved of office, and a number were even executed. At age 32, after less than 15 years in the military, Gregor Trilkin was placed in charge of the entire Imperium armed forces. One of Trilkin's first acts in his new position was to commission the creation of a superweapon to put a final end to the Freedom Guard. A little over a year later, Imperium scientists developed the Desiccator. Gerhard Bantrol. Gerhard Bantrol was the son of an Imperium senator. At age 18, he joined the Imperium army, but retired 4 years later, shortly after an incident in the Calderine system, when he ordered the slaughter of a group of marked workers who'd escaped from an agricultural labor colony. He then studied political and military history at the great University of Utrecht, where he graduated with honors. Bantrol's family pushed him to move into politics, but he took a position as a professor at a university on Auran instead. Bantrol was a great orator, and his reputation grew within the intellectual community. At age 37, he was made president of the Central University Alliance and established the Great Library Cycle. Unknown to most of Bantrol's friends and colleagues, he became increasingly disenchanted with the Imperium regime and had organized a small group of politicians and intellectuals who were running an underground for escaped members of the marked class. When the revolution began, Bantrol was still living on Auran and established the Freedom Guard resistance there. For this act, a bounty was placed on his head by the Imperium ruling directorate, of which his father was now a member. Gerhard Bantrol recruited the young Jeb Radic to lead his forces, and the two became good friends. Eventually, Radic and Bantrol came to confront the Synod, to control the Synod, and guide the fate of the entire Freedom Guard cause. While Radic was the military commander and had ultimate authority, Bantrol was the Freedom Guard's great orator and diplomat, and Radic entrusted him with all matters of negotiation and administration. Benth Martel. Benth Martel was the son of a decorated Imperium general, J.T. Martel. From early youth, Benth was trained in the finest military academies. In his late 20s, Martel published a treatise titled Modern Ground Tactics. The volume was the first detailed analysis of the effects of hover technology on ground-based engagement strategy, and it almost immediately became standard reference material for military officers around the galaxy. Freedom Guard High Commander Gerhard Bantrol called Martel one of the most remarkable military minds of our age. Martel and Bantrol faced each other in the siege of Resnik. Although outnumbered nearly 4-1 and without supplies, Martel was able to hold the city for over 6 weeks until reinforcements arrived. Martel was also one of the few Imperial generals to ever defeat Freedom Guard commander Radic in combat. Shortly after General Trilkin was placed in charge of the entire war effort, Colonel Martel was recalled from frontline duty and assigned to escort supply convoys. Although most of his colleagues understood that Martel had been reassigned because Radic feared his subordinate's reputation and ability, Martel accepted his duty without hesitation, stating that, quote, "In the battle to preserve order, no role is insignificant."